You're listening to the Ecocide Report, a monthly podcast from Stop Ecocide International and the Movement for Ecocide Law. Stop Ecocide International is working tirelessly to get ecocide recognised by the International Criminal Court, but we need your help. If you value this content or want to support the work of Stop Ecocide International, you can become a patron over at patreon.com for just 1 hour's wage per month. Your support makes our work possible, and we can't thank you enough.
Hello everyone, thank you for joining my friend and I. Jojo Murtha is a co-founder of Stop Ecocide International, a global advocacy group looking at issues around ecocide and preserving a natural world. And as we have this conversation now, it's been a really, really busy part of the year. COP27 is just behind us. COP15 in Montreal is just ahead of us. And I wanted to sit with Jojo, talk about your schedule, all the things you've been doing, all the things you're planning to do as we reach this really busy part of the year.
Fantastic. And great to be with you again, Chidi. We've just come back last week from COP27 in Egypt, and that was quite an experience. For the first time, we had a stand there, a pavilion as they're known, and so there was a kind of presence that we brought to the conference that has not been possible for us before. And it made a huge difference, actually, for people to be able to come and find us, look us up. We also took part in a whole number of panel events. We had an official side event there, which 2 different states contributed to, Vanuatu and Belgium. And that was moderated by UNEP, the UN Environment Programme. So, hugely prestigious. And we've been told by a number of attendees that it was one of the most exciting events of the official programme. So that's very exciting. But I think the key thing that we came away with from the perspective of our work is that it was an amazing profile raising exercise, regardless of the high level results of the negotiations, which were of course mixed. From our perspective, from the moment we opened the pavilion, there was a constant flow of interested visitors, including lots of high level politicians and ministers and so on. So really very exciting time.
That's excellent. Let's explore that in more detail. So within the context of what was going on in Sharm el-Sheikh, having your own pavilion allows you to be a lot more focused, to have a specific panel discussion, to talk about things with specific participants, and to come to some conclusion. Could you talk in more detail about that?
Yeah, I think the main aim for us was to bring this issue of criminal law framing into the discussions around climate, because I think there's a lot of dot joining that still needs to be done around climate issues and the issues of biodiversity loss or nature loss, which of course will be the focus of the Montreal conference that we're heading to shortly. And people don't always connect those two. And of course, the issue of ecocide or mass destruction of nature is an absolutely joining piece. It's a root cause of both climate breakdown and ecological breakdown. Even if we stopped all emissions tomorrow, if we continue to destroy these vital ecosystems and carbon sinks, we will still have a deepening climate crisis. So, it's kind of inserting a piece into that conversation, and this was the first time that we'd had the opportunity to do that as part of the official programme. So it's inserting that piece and having people think about that framing, because I think in the context of climate, law is not discussed a lot, and criminal law even less so. But I think what we can see around the world, from grassroots, but right up to those, conference halls of the UN, is this incredible frustration with how slow action is moving in terms of actually responding to the level of crisis that we're facing. And, for us, that's very much about the fact that the right framing isn't in place. And so that, I think, was the key kind of, aim that we had in bringing, that official side event, but in sort of inserting that piece into all the discussions that we had at COP27.
Thank you for that. Well, I think you're absolutely right. I think that one of the core and perhaps the most important link that Stop Ecocide International creates is the link between dealing with excessive carbon in the atmosphere and dealing with the denusion of all these huge natural sinks for carbon, ecosystems both on land and in the ocean. And I think that sets the stage perfectly, actually, for your next move, which is attending COP15 in Montreal, which is eponymous this year because, of course, the Montreal Protocol solved a gigantic problem with the ozone layer many years ago, and now we potentially have the opportunity in Montreal this year to do what? What are you going to be doing? What are you going to be discussing?
Well, the conference itself focuses on coming to an agreement around a global biodiversity framework, which is kind of a set of targets, I suppose, that are meant to be sort of umbrella targets that can kind of be applied across the board, in the context of various other different treaties, agreements, pledges, policy making, and so on. Obviously, again, we're keen to get this whole element of the legal framework into that mix. Maybe in the best possible case scenarios, language even into the text. We're also aware how difficult that can be, but certainly to use the opportunity of a presence there. Again, we'll have a pavilion there. Is the raising of awareness around these sort of framing legal questions that actually ultimately are enabling conditions for the implementation, for the reaching of those targets. So that's going to be, our sort of key focus. And the time that we spend over the next couple of weeks in Montreal is also going to be a little bit split, because some of us will actually be, some of our team, including myself, will be in The Hague in the Netherlands before we head out to Montreal, because the first week of the Biodiversity COP is also happening at the same time as the International Criminal Court's Assembly of States Parties to the Rome Statute, and that happens every year, mostly in The Hague, sometimes in New York. So we'll be in The Hague next week for that. And that, of course, is an absolutely key forum for us, because what we're aiming for is for that treaty to be amended to include the crime of ecocide. So that's going to be a very exciting moment for us as well.
Wow. I'd go further than that. I'd amplify that hugely and say this is beyond exciting. This is a fairly tumultuous 2 weeks you're facing. You're going to be talking. You're going to be talking about rewriting the Treaty of Rome in 1 week, and literally days later, you're gathering in Montreal of all places to try and convince a conference of parties there to potentially insert Stop Ecocide International into a communique that comes out of that gathering. What are the levers you think might be able to pull? What are the factors you think will determine whether or not you're successful? And what's your fantasy outcome?
Well, I think in the case of The Hague, it's very much in the kind of amplification phase. We know that the International Criminal Court itself is taking this discussion very seriously, and one of the ways we know that is that our side event, joint with the Republic of Vanuatu, as we've done for the last few years, has actually been allocated the plenary hall for its venue. So that and in the prime slot of the week. So it just shows that this is a conversation that has really sort of exactly is taking centre stage. So that's a really important step, and we will have a pretty heavyweight panel there to discuss the stage that we're at, why it's appropriate for the International Criminal Court to be addressing this, for this crime to be in the Rome Statute. Effectively, our event is global crisis and the role of the ICC and the relevance of ecocide as the fifth crime. So it's looking forward to the future of the court, to its role in the world, to keeping it relevant in the context of the biggest challenge humanity's ever faced. And of course, to show that destruction of nature, serious destruction of nature, should be on a par with serious destruction of people and property, and that this is actually, although it on one level feels quite a surgical thing to sort of, advocate for the addition of one crime to a list, but on another level, it's really quite a profound potential shift in how we view our relationship with the living world, which has to change. It has to evolve if we're going to come through this in as few pieces as possible.
100%. No, thank you for that. And that was a really good exposition of the factors around the Treaty of Rome and talking at the ICC. And congratulations on getting the plenary. I think that's, I'm really impressed by that. But let's build on that into Montreal, and let's have that same conversation about the key factors, the key possibilities, and your fantasy outcome from that. How do you see that evolving?
Okay, so I mean, I'll start with the fantasy outcome. And the fantasy outcome would be to have criminal law frameworks mentioned in the outcome text. There's by no means any guarantee on that. We know how hard that is when you're negotiating. And I've been in the UN negotiating halls, and I know how slow and painful sometimes those negotiations word by word can be, but that would obviously be incredible. At the very least, what we aim to do, and we know we will do, is bring this aspect into the halls of the conference, into the conversations that are happening in the side events, in the panels. We also have a venue close to the conference where we're putting on our own small program with half a dozen events, some with really quite high level participants, and that is going to be another aspect. So it's also that kind of profile raising in a general sense as well, also with civil society. And we have a fantastic team in Canada as well, so some of our international team will be there, and the Canadian team will also be there. So there's going to be quite certainly a good amount of noise made around ecocide law, and more obviously important meetings that tend to emerge in the context of these high-level conferences. I think sometimes people get very disappointed and disillusioned with the fact that the outcomes never feel as muscular as they should be. And of course, it's really difficult when you're operating in a kind of consensus-based situation. It's really hard to sort of move forward in those ways. But let's not discount the fact that what these conferences do is bring together civil society actors, really often quite remarkable solutions building companies and, private and public initiatives, and all of these people into a mix where they get to interact with these high-level actors. And what that does is it often creates a real kind of sort of cooking pot, I suppose, of solutions and narratives that need to be heard at the high level, and these occasions give the possibility for that. So that is, of course, why we need to be present at these conferences.
100%. So the conference in Montreal has, I'm going to ask these questions almost rhetorically, has a set number of participants. It has civil society and advocacy groups like yours, which are very important because they balance out the lobbying capacity of industry, which will also be there. But when we've talked about this in the past, we've often talked about how important it is for industry itself to reach these kinds of agreements because it gives them clarity, it allows for more planning, and within the context of what's happened, obviously, over the past couple of years, Shell, for example, has been asked by a Hague court to take into account the impact of its operations on ecosystems. Now, thinking about that context within which, industrial counterparties are sort of parties in and of themselves, are there things you would like to say to people who are coming into COP in Montreal that might encourage them to meet with you, participate in further work with you, and develop this in a progressive, functionally capable way?
Absolutely, because I think what is beginning to emerge here is this awareness that there is a need for policy, for regulation, in order to accelerate the strategic positive change that is needed in many of the different industrial sectors. And there's this kind of awareness, there is a growing awareness and an appetite, in the corporate world for frameworks that will help those innovations, those changes, those shifts in direction to take place. Because, we've probably talked about this before, but, finance and funds, money just has a tendency to flow down the path of least resistance. So, if there are not certain, kind of corrective aspects put in place, it's hard to actually start moving in a new direction. I mean, humans, we're creatures of habit. We really are. We don't tend to shift what we do on a regular basis unless with some kind of external stimulus or with a change in the rules. And of course, that's where we come in. And we will be doing a particular panel actually on this whole factor of accelerating strategic positive change. And for example, we're going to be having Gonzalo Munoz talking at that, who was one of the high-level champions in for the Race to Zero, and other fantastic business voices, because I think this is really important. And actually what's been so kind of inspiring in a way is that and I think it's important here to mention the international definition of ecocide, which is very concise at its core. Ecocide means unlawful or wanton acts committed with knowledge that there's a substantial likelihood of severe and either widespread or long-term damage to the environment being caused by those acts. Now, that's a really concise definition, and when we put it in front of anyone that's an expert in their sector, what we see is something remarkable. What we see is that they're immediately responding with a set of questions, because they're looking at that and they're thinking instantly, how does this apply to what I do? And so those kind of questions that start to emerge are super important. And actually, you know, we feel that's kind of gold dust, because the way that the human brain works, you ask a question, you will start finding an answer. And part of the problem here is that, you know, industry is not necessarily always known what are the questions that we need to be asking. And when you put a simple, clear framework in front of somebody, then that actually is starting to trigger those desperately needed questions. So I think that is one of the key aspects of what we'll be bringing to those conversations with corporate actors, with the business sector, and also the finance sector. I mean, it's been really interesting, actually, that the same network that asked governments last year to think about criminalising ecocide reiterated that just a few weeks ago at COP27, and that was the International Corporate Governance Network. So that's the second year in a row that this network of some of the biggest financial firms in the world has been saying to governments, collaborate internationally to criminalise ecocide. You know, there's this realisation that that framework can create a stability and an impetus that is desperately needed.
That's excellent. That's really excellent. So at COP27, there was supposed to be a revisiting of the Glasgow Alliance for Net Zero, GFANZ, and that was also mixed. There were no concrete outcomes from that particular group that moved the dial forward for aligning financial flows to net zero more rapidly, unfortunately. But I'm thinking, is there, in your mind, the potential for a similar group to be pulled together at COP15? So a group of nations or parties or corporates who would like to see some kind of framework of natural asset pricing, natural asset consolidation, or even working with groups like the TNFD, the Task Force for Nature-Related Financial Disclosure. Are those kinds of concrete policy elements in the mix already, or?
I do believe they are. I mean, I have to say this is not my particular area of expertise, but I am aware, for example, that, I mean, this is one of the aspects that the UK has been really quite interested in terms of, you know, their contribution to those discussions, is to look at some of those structures that can help in terms of actually shifting the economy towards something that is more nature-based and nature-focused. And I think those aspects are going to be very important in that, you know, in that arena. As an advocacy organisation, and of course with our particular focus around the law, we're not specifically involved in those particular high-level discussions, but they do of course intersect with you know, some of the conversations we have, some of the events that we hold, and so on. So, you know, all of those things are important, and I think this is something that you know, is really emerging everywhere, is that collaborations are important, that, you know, different kinds of agreements are also important. You know, effectively, there is no one solution to all of this. But what we would say, and this is, we think, very sort of specific to, you know, our particular initiative, to the Ecocide Law Initiative, which is, you know, is really now a global movement. There's no way around that. We sort of sit at the heart of it, but it's way beyond us now. You know, is that it actually acts as a kind of a bridging piece. You know, it's not that it's a silver bullet. It's not that it's suddenly going to cure every single environmental woe or prevent every single environmental damage. You know, I mean, no crime can do that. I mean, obviously, you know, murder's been a crime since, what, Moses and beyond. And people still get killed. But can you imagine what it would be like if it wasn't a crime? And I think that's the kind of difference that I think we're looking at here. And I think this is something that environmental NGOs, for example, are just beginning to get their heads around. You know, seeing that, you know, the Ecocide Law Initiative is not another sort of parallel environmental initiative. It's actually something that supports all of the environmental campaigns. I mean, there is no environmental campaign in the world that will not be supported by having ecocide law in place. So it is one of those kind of, it's a foundational piece. It's a kind of, it's a sort of bridging piece that kind of moves towards being able to, support the rest of environmental law, encourage everybody who's already working on improving regulation in all of these different areas. It will support all of those things.
That's amazing. I couldn't agree more. I think earlier on we were talking casually and chatting, and I said, isn't it nice, or wouldn't it be nice to have a law that supports organic carbon sequestration, which is a really awkward, weird and nerdy way of saying a law that just supports life.
Yes.
Isn't it nice just to have to argue for that, advocate that, and show people the obviousness of the truth on that point?
And that was fascinating, actually. You're reminding me of one of the conversations we had in one of our events at COP27. We had this wonderful young Indigenous spokeswoman from one of the First Nations in Canada. And the moderator was asking her about, how does kind of ecocide law fit in with the kind of cultural assumptions and approaches of, of your culture and so on. And what was so interesting was that, in a sense, it was so obvious to her that she almost couldn't understand the question. And when she finally got what she was being asked, she went, oh God, of course, it's rule number 1, don't damage Mother Earth. It was like, but it was so obvious that it was almost too obvious to address. And I think that's really interesting, isn't it? That effectively our globally dominant way of thinking doesn't see it as obvious as that. And it should be, otherwise we are simply, whoever it is, we're drilling holes in the boat, we're all in. And, if we can't see that, then hopefully putting this law in place will actually start to nudge us into that direction where that is much more obvious.
100%. So we talk about a whole bunch of new frameworks that are coming out. We talk about Professor Rayworth's donut economics. We talk about sort of the outer boundaries of our ecosphere, of the world we live in. And you're right, there's a tendency to focus on the outer boundaries and the constraints around fossil fuels and the carbon that comes out of that sort of one component element, one component resource. But looking at our ecocide prospects, looking at our entire ecosystem, looking at that full-bodied automatic boundary that is so intuitive to everyone is something that is, well, at the very least equally important.
Yes.
You'd imagine ubiquitously important, really obvious, and worth following through. And I'm really excited for you that getting a chance to do this in Montreal. As I said, it's iconic in the sense of the Montreal Protocol itself got us away from the expanding ozone layer because, groups within the UN got together and made a solid, functional decision.
Indeed, it's a kind of benchmark that sort of looked back to us. There was an environmental treaty that worked.
Absolutely.
Can we have another one, please?
And it was huge. No one expected it to succeed. Yeah. And it really did. And it's making this huge difference. The number of lives that have been saved, just astronomical. And it's been so successful, it isn't even talked about anymore. It's just, oh yeah, well, we did that. And so next. But hopefully we'll get to the point where we'll have that conversation about ecocide soon as well.
Wouldn't that be fantastic?
Absolutely. Yeah, no, we will. I'm sure we will.
You've been listening to the Ecocide Report. You can find out more about all of the issues discussed in this episode via the links in the podcast description. Thanks so much for listening, and see you next time.